Let me just explain in 2 minutes the Ukraine war. This is not an attack by Putin on Ukraine in the way that we are told every day. This started in 1990, February 9th, 1990. James Baker III, our Secretary of State, said to Mikhail Gorbachev, NATO will not move 1 inch eastward if you agree to German unification, basically ending World War II.
First of all, I would note that Baker, who supposedly made this deal, categorically denies that he ever said it, as does George H.W. Bush. Mm-hmm. He says that it never happened and that there was never such a conversation. Mm-hmm. So that's a question mark.
And Gorbachev said that's very important. Yes, NATO doesn't move, and we agreed to German unification. The U.S. then cheated on this, already starting in 1994, when Clinton signed off on basically a plan to expand NATO all the way to Ukraine.
NATO will not automatically exclude any nation from joining. At the same time, no country outside will be allowed to veto expansion.
This is when the so-called neocons took power, and Clinton was the first agent of this. And the expansion of NATO started in 1999 with Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic.
Today we welcome Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, finally erasing the boundary line the Cold War artificially imposed on the continent of Europe. Our goal is to help to build a Europe that is undivided, free, democratic, at peace, and secure. A Europe in which Russia, Ukraine, and other states of the former Soviet Union join with us to make common cause. We have to reinforce the practical cooperation between NATO and Russia and NATO and Ukraine. We have to see through our efforts to secure a lasting peace in the Balkans, and we cannot walk away until the job is done.
At that point, Russia didn't much care. There was no border other than with the Königsberg, but other than that, there was no direct threat. Then the U.S. led the bombing of Serbia in 1999. That was bad, by the way, because that was a use of NATO to bomb a European capital, Belgrade, 78 straight days to break the country apart. The Russians didn't like that very much. But Putin became president, they swallowed it, they complained, but even Putin started out pro-European, pro-American, actually asked maybe we should join NATO when there was still the idea of some kind of mutually respectful relationship.
At a meeting here in the Kremlin with the outgoing President Bill Clinton, right here in the next room, I said to him, I asked him, Bill, do you think if Russia asked to join NATO, do you think it would happen? Suddenly he said, you know, it's interesting. I think so. But in the evening, when we met for dinner, he said, you know, I've talked to my team. No, it's not possible now.
Then 9/11 came, then came Afghanistan, and the Russians said, yeah, we'll support you, we understand, to root out terror. But then came two other decisive actions. In 2002, the United States unilaterally walked out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty.
Neither side would launch a nuclear attack because it knew the other would respond, thereby destroying both. Today, I have given formal notice to Russia, in accordance with the treaty, that the United States of America is withdrawing from this almost 30-year-old treaty. I have concluded the ABM treaty hinders our government's ability to develop ways to protect our people from future terrorists or rogue state missile attacks. We know that the terrorists and some of those who support them seek the ability to deliver death and destruction to our doorstep via missile. And we must have the freedom and the flexibility to develop effective defenses against those attacks. President Putin and I have also agreed that my decision to withdraw from the treaty will not in any way undermine our new relationship or Russian security. As President Putin said in Crawford, we are on the path to a fundamentally different relationship.
This was probably the most decisive event, never discussed in this context. But what it did was trigger the U.S. putting in missile systems in Eastern Europe that Russia views as a dire, direct threat to national security by making possible a decapitation strike of missiles that are a few minutes away from Moscow. And we put in 2 Aegis missile systems. We say it's defense. Russia says, how do we know it's not Tomahawk nuclear-tipped missiles in your silos? You've told us we have nothing to do with this. And so we walked out of the ABM treaty unilaterally in 2002. And then in 2003, we invaded Iraq on completely phony pretenses, as I've explained. In 2004-05, we engaged in a soft regime change operation in Ukraine, the so-called First Color Revolution. It put in office somebody that I knew and I was friends with, and I'm kind of distantly friends with President Yushchenko, because I was an advisor to the Ukrainian government in 1993, 94, 95. And then the U.S. had its dirty hands in this. It should not meddle in other countries' elections. But in 2009, Yanukovych won the election, and he became president in 2010 on the basis of neutrality for Ukraine. That calmed things down because the U.S. was pushing NATO, but the people of Ukraine on the opinion polls didn't even want to be in NATO. They knew that the country is divided between ethnic Ukrainian, ethnic Russian. What do we want with this? We want to stay away from your problems. So in February 22nd, 2014, the United States participated actively in the overthrow of Yanukovych. A typical U.S. regime change operation, have no doubt about it. And the Russians did us a favor. They intercepted a really ugly call between Victoria Nuland, my colleague at Columbia University now, and if you know her name and what she's done, have sympathy for me. Really. Between her and the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Sachs, who's a senior State Department official till today, and they talked about regime change. They said, who's going to be the next government? Why don't we pick this one? No, Klitschko shouldn't go in. It should be Yatsenyuk. Yes, it was Yatsenyuk, and we'll get the big guy, Biden, to come in and do an attaboy, they say, pat him on the back. It's great.
We're engaging on a daily basis with the Ukrainian government to make sure that we get a positive outcome there.
Russians have repeatedly accused the United States government of interfering in Ukraine's politics. The U.S. government has to some degree made reciprocal claims about Russia. Does not the fact that U.S. diplomats purportedly are discussing who should and should not be in a Ukrainian government hint at some possibility of U.S. interference here?
Absolutely not.
What do you think?
I think we're in play. The Klitschko piece is obviously the complicated electron here, especially the announcement of him as deputy prime minister. And you've seen some of my notes on the troubles in the marriage right now, so we're trying to get a read really fast on where he is on this stuff. But I think your argument to him, which you'll need to make, I think that's the next phone call we want to set up, is exactly the one you made to Yachts. And I'm glad you sort of put him on the spot on where he fits in this scenario. And I'm very glad he said what he said in response.
Good. So I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea. I think Yachts is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, you know, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week. You know, I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Okay.
When I talked to Jeff Feltman this morning, he had a new name for the UN guy, Robert Seri. Did I write you that this morning?
Yeah, I saw that.
He's now gotten both Seri and Ban Ki-moon to agree that Seri could come in Monday or Tuesday.
Okay.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, you know, fuck the EU.
No, exactly. And
So they made the new government. And I happened to be invited to go there soon after that, not knowing any of the background. And then some of it was, in a very ugly way, explained to me after I arrived, how the U.S. had participated in this. All of this is to say, the U.S. then said, okay, now NATO's really going to enlarge. And Putin kept saying, stop. You promised no NATO enlargement. It's been, by the way, I forgot to mention, in 2004, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, 7 more countries in the not 1 inch eastward.
Адаптированный договор об обычных вооруженных силах в Европе был подписан в 1999 году. Он учитывал новую геополитическую реальность – ликвидацию Варшавского блока. С тех пор прошло 7 лет, и только 4 государства ратифицировали этот документ, включая Российскую Федерацию. Страны НАТО открыто заявили, что не ратифицируют договор, включая положение о фланговых ограничениях, о размещении на флангах определенного количества вооруженных сил, до тех пор, пока Россия не выведет свои базы из Грузии и Молдавии. Из Грузии наши войска выводятся, причем даже в ускоренном порядке. Эти проблемы мы с нашими грузинскими коллегами решили, и это всем известно. В Молдавии остается группировка в 1500 военнослужащих, которые выполняют миротворческие функции и охраняют склады с боеприпасами, оставшиеся со времен СССР. И мы с господином Соланой обсуждаем постоянно этот вопрос. Он знает нашу позицию, мы готовы и дальше работать по этому направлению. Но что же происходит в это же самое время? А в это самое время в Болгарии и Румынии появляются так называемые легкие американские передовые базы по 5000 штыков в каждой. Получается, что НАТО выдвигает свои передовые силы к нашим государственным границам. А мы, строго выполняя договор, никак не реагируем на эти действия. Думаю, очевидно, процесс натовского расширения не имеет никакого отношения к модернизации самого Альянса или к обеспечению безопасности в Европе. Наоборот, это серьезно провоцирующий фактор, снижающий уровень взаимного доверия. И у нас есть справедливое право откровенно спросить, против кого это расширение. И что стало с теми заверениями, которые давались западными партнерами после распуска Варшавского договора? Где теперь эти заявления? О них даже никто не помнит. Но я позволю себе напомнить в этой аудитории. Хотел бы привести цитату из выступления генерального секретаря НАТО, господина Вернера, в Брюсселе 17 мая 1990 года. Он тогда сказал: «Сам факт, что мы готовы не размещать войска НАТО за пределами территории ФРГ, дает Советскому Союзу твердые гарантии безопасности». Где эти гарантии? Камни и бетонные блоки Берлинской стены давно разошлись на сувениры. Но нельзя забывать, что ее падение стало возможным в том числе и благодаря историческому выбору, в том числе нашего народа, народа России. Выбору в пользу демократии и свободы, открытости и искреннего партнерства со всеми членами большой европейской семьи. Сейчас же нам пытаются навязать уже новые разделительные линии, стены, пусть виртуальные, но все-таки разделяющие, разрезающие наш общий континент. Неужели вновь потребуются долгие годы и десятилетия, смена нескольких поколений политиков, чтобы разобрать и демонтировать эти новые стены?
The U.S. kept rejecting the basic idea, don't expand NATO to Russia's border in a context where we're putting in goddamn missile systems. After breaking a treaty, 2019, we walked out of the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty. In 2017, we walked out of the JCPOA, the treaty with Iran. This is the partner. This is the trust building. In other words, it's completely reckless U.S. foreign policy. On December 15, 2021, Putin put on the table a draft Russia-U.S. security agreement. You can find it online. The basis of it is no NATO enlargement. I called the White House that next week after that, begging them, take the negotiations. Putin's offered something, avoid this war. Oh, Jeff, there's not going to be a war. Announce that NATO's not going to enlarge. Oh, don't worry, NATO's not going to enlarge. I said, oh, you're going to have a war over something that's not going to happen? Why don't you announce it? And he said, no, our policy is an open door. This is Jake Sullivan. Our policy is an open door policy. Open door for NATO enlargement. That is under the category of bullshit, by the way. You don't have your right to put your military bases anywhere you want and expect peace in this world. You have to have some prudence. There's no such thing as an open door that we're going to be there and we're going to put our missile systems there and that's our right. There's no right to that. We declared in 1823, Europeans don't come to the Western Hemisphere. That's the Monroe Doctrine. The whole Western Hemisphere, after all. Okay, anyway, they turned down the negotiations. Then the special military operation started, and 5 days later, Zelensky says, okay, neutrality. And then the Turks said, we'll mediate this. And I flew to Ankara to discuss it with the Turkish negotiators because I wanted to hear exactly what was going on. So what was going on was they reached an agreement with a few odds and ends. And then the United States and Britain said, no way, you guys fight on. We got your back. We don't have your front, you're all gonna die. But we got your back. As we kept pushing them into the front lines. That's 600,000 deaths now of Ukrainians since Boris Johnson flew to Kyiv to tell them to be brave. Absolutely ghastly.
There was a story first told by former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett that both sides were really close to the end, to the successful end of the negotiations. And
אין לי say, אני בסך הכל מוציא לפועל ומתווך, אבל הכתובת שלי זה אמריקה בעניין הזה, ואני לא פועל על דעת עצמי. כל פעולה שעשיתי הייתה מתואמת לפרטי פרטים, גם עם ארצות הברית, גם עם גרמניה, גם עם צרפת.
ובעצם חדלו את זה?
בגדול, כן. בגדול הם חדלו את זה, ובאותו זמן חשבתי שהם שוגים.
And then, Ukrainian representative Arahami kind of confirmed it. That yes, he said in an interview that there was some kind of advice from Boris Johnson to stop negotiating and to win this war militarily.
And one thing I really do want to demolish, and you know, I'd love your assistance in this because it is such a lie, is the idea that the UK was somehow instrumental in preventing a peace agreement in April 2022, 2 months after the war.
When you went out?
When I went out, I can assure you it is an absolute steaming, stinking lie. There was no way that Zelensky could have agreed to anything like the terms that were on offer in Istanbul. I never discussed any of that with Zelensky. That wasn't the purpose of my trip at all. But I can assure you, even if I had raised the question of the Istanbul talks with Zelensky, there was no way they were going to do a deal, whatever we said. And I certainly did nothing to frustrate any such agreement. There was no. I don't think any Ukrainian president could have agreed to those terms.
So, when you think about your question, we have to understand we're not dealing with, as we're told every day, with this madman like Hitler coming at us and violating this and violating that, and he's going to take over Europe. This is complete bogus, fake history that is a purely PR narrative of the U.S. government. And it doesn't stand up at all.
We are, let's face it, we're waging a proxy war. We're waging a proxy war, but we're not giving our proxies the ability to do the job. And for years and years now, we've been allowing them to fight with one hand tied behind their backs, and it has been cruel. It has been cruel. And we need now to give them what they need. So 3 things we need to do. To get this thing done, we need to give them the weaponry they need, give them the permissions they need, give them all the military support, logistical, tactical, we can without coming into direct conflict with the Russians ourselves. Number 2, we need to give them the money, and I talked about the 300 billion. But number 3, we need to make it, we need to get absolutely, and by the way, we should do more than just the 300 billion. We should construct a kind of lend-lease loan for Ukraine, and $500 billion or whatever, so that Putin knows. This is all about Russia knowing what the end state is. Get back to my key point. The Ukrainians, the Russians, the world has to know where we, America, UK, Europe, want this thing to end up. And we have allowed that ambiguity to drift on and on and on. And that is the whole problem with Ukraine. Unless and until we clear it up, you won't persuade Putin to back down, and you won't get a peace. So
everybody understand, what does it mean to stand with Ukraine like Boris Johnson stands with Ukraine? It means 2,000 Ukrainians killed or wounded severely every single day. That's not standing with Ukraine. That is standing with the destruction of Ukraine. It's exactly the opposite. And so that's a purely Orwellian idea that we're standing with Ukraine by continuing this war. But I think there's another point that is important in this. I'm not without hope for a quite different reason. And that is that our politics is not determined by American presidents. Our politics is determined by the security state apparatus. And what is happening right now is not in America's security interest. And so they could change their mind. And President Putin said something actually very interesting in an interview in 2017, I think in Figaro, by the time that he had had three presidents as his counterparts, Bush, Obama, and Trump. And he said to this reporter, French reporter in 2017, he said, you know, I've dealt with three American presidents now. They come into office with ideas, but then men in dark suits and blue ties come to tell them how the real situation is, and you never hear of those ideas again. And this is from a very tough-minded leader who was himself KGB. He understands how the American system works very well. He understands what the CIA means for American foreign policy. He understands that American foreign policy is very deeply rooted. It's not this one wins and then Obama changes everything and then Trump comes in and changes. Nothing like that, by the way. This has been a consistent foreign policy, arguably, certainly since 1991, and arguably since 1945. And by the way, British foreign policy is the same. And I would say arguably British foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia goes back to 1840. It was around 1840 that the British government got the idea that Russia was a threat to Britain, to the British Empire through Central Asia, and the idea that Britain was going to, that Russia was going to invade India through the Khyber Pass. And this became an idée fixe, and it became the basis for the Crimean War in 1853 to 1856, and Russophobia basically never abated. Of course, at two junctures, Britain aligned with the Soviet Union, or aligned with Russia in World War I and aligned with the Soviet Union in World War II. And the Soviet Union, of course, with 27 million dead, broke the back of Hitler's army, not Britain or the United States, which take all the credit for it. They can't even remember. They don't even invite the Russian leaders. And Russia bore the whole brunt of fighting the Wehrmacht. But then as soon as, you know, in the middle of 1945, after 27 million dead in the Soviet Union and an alliance with the Soviet Union, Churchill asked the War Office to consider, what about invading the Soviet Union now, Operation Unthinkable? In other words, let's continue the war. Germany just surrendered, now we should go invade the Soviet Union. That was not put as a defensive war game. That was an actual idea of Churchill in the summer of 1945, and the United States said, no, actually, let's not have another war right now. But that's a kind of, that's a little weird, by the way. But that's how Britain has thought for, so my point is these are very deep, consistent trends, and Britain taught the United States everything it knows, and we continue on the same deep trend. What we need is that the Pentagon and the CIA and the other intelligence agencies come to understand we're in a multipolar world. We face a nuclear superpower in China, a nuclear superpower in Russia. There is no meaning of victory. Tragedy is not an option, as far as I'm concerned, for a policy. And so we need a different strategy. And then somebody in a dark suit and a blue tie will come to tell whoever's president that we're doing it differently now. And that's what we can hope for.